Hey guys, OGAlbina here, and welcome to SPL Season 2 Week 1 Draft Notes. For those of you who are new here, hi, my name's Owen, or OGAlbina. I typically do analyst work for the SPL, in which I go over the matchups for the upcoming week, and once games start getting played, we'll go over some highlights from the previous week, and, go over our pick'em score and everything like that. So if you guys are interested in this analyst series, I put in a lot of work for it. I would really appreciate it if you dropped a sub, helped us push towards our goal of 5,000 subscribers by the end of the year. And with that being said, typically we jump into a recap of the previous week, then go into some cool plays and sets that happened. But obviously, since this is week 1, we're actually going to jump right into the week 1 matchups, go over what I think about them as a very experienced draft league player, and say who I think will potentially take home the W and all that stuff. So yeah, with that being said, let's jump into it. Alright guys, the first matchup we're going to look at is going to be Haydunn versus Leo. Now from Haydunn's side, as crazy as it is, I think Darkrai actually really struggles here between things like Overqwil and Tinkaton, which isn't mentioned on this week's graphic. It was just a graphical error, be fixed next week. But Leo obviously does have the Tinkaton plus the Overqwil. It really struggles clicking a move. It's two of the Dark and Fairy types that really deal with Darkrai's coverage for said Pokemon very well. So I think Darkrai's actually going to struggle in the breaking category that it typically would. Plus you have Pokemon like Great Tusk that, obviously were just Dark Pulse. It's really hard to click Psychic or Ice Beam in this battle as well, with the Tinkaton and the Overqwil in the back. So I think Darkrai actually has a really rough matchup. However, its partner ShuckleKing has a great matchup in my opinion. I think Assault Vest is probably the set you go with here, either Assault Vest or a Heavy Duty Boot set, in order to check that Iron Bundle as well as humanly possible, and have as much offensive coverage as you want. Honestly, Psychic plus Poison hits this team incredibly hard. You probably want fire coverage as well. And then outside of the Overqwil, which if you're forcing in consistently to take flamethrowers or something of the sort, it's really going to get whittled down. Plus we have the option of obviously future sighting up and then going into something that really breaks down Overqwil, like a Gliscor. That could be a great combination because Ground plus Psychic hits this team incredibly hard. So I think an AV ShuckleKing is personally what I would go with, just to check any kind of crazy specs bundle variant, because outside of GlowKing, bundle does really well potentially, and outside of Sylveon potentially as well. I think Gliscor really struggles getting up hazards this week reliably versus Tusk, but if it baits it in early and gets a Toxic off on it, or if it starts clicking Earthquake consistently as it comes in, Tusk doesn't have means of reliable recovery or much wish into it on this team, obviously. So if you can whittle it down early, you can get up some spikes and some rocks later, which really does help that Darkrai and that ShuckleKing out. The only issue is Tusk does spin on you pretty freely in the early game, so I don't think you want to initially set up hazards. I think you want to whittle things down if you can. I also think a Swords Dance variant could put in some work, but that's to be seen. I think that Terra Jolteon feels very solid. I wish it could be Terra Ice this week. I think it's a better neutral typing than Fairy, but I think you do go Fairy here. It hits the Great Tusk. It hits a lot of things neutrally, and you kind of just Volt Switch around forever. It also hits the Appleton. Ogerpon isn't going to stuff you, but Ogerpon obviously can't hold Boots, being locked into the Hearthflame mask that it has to hold. So Jolteon plus Rocks seems really powerful in this matchup, to be completely honest, especially because the Great Tusk is not going to want to come in so that it can do what it wants to offensively and defensively otherwise, which I think it's a little stretched thin in that regards. I think Gyarados is really solid defensively as a check to something like the Great Tusk, which goes absolutely crazy. Now, there are the options of Supercell Slam plus Stone Edge. I don't think Supercell Slam is great in this matchup, because if we're expecting that on our Gyarados, right, we pivot in on a close combat, on an Ice Spinner, on a Headlong Rush, we get the Intim off, and then we think that a Supercell Slam is coming out, we can go hard Gliscor, force 50% chip on that Great Tusk, and now it's basically a dead Pokemon, right? I think Stone Edge is probably a little bit more likely from Leo's side, or at least in my opinion, what I would bring if I were in Leo's shoes. But regardless, Gyarados is going to be a very solid pivot into that Pokemon, and if it doesn't respect the Gyarados defensively, a Rocky Helmet variant could really whittle that thing down really well, so I think that's cool. Serperior has some value here, I think, as a sub-leech Pokemon. Obviously, you're kind of stuffed by Ogerpon, but again, Rocks plus Leaf Storm plus probably the Dragon Pulse coverage that you're carrying for Appleton anyways is going to be a great way of whittling that thing down. The Zapdos is probably going to come in and U-turn, but if we're consistently whittling it down, which Leech Seed turns and Leaf Storms and Dragon Pulses and things like that, and get at him pretty quickly, and once that Zapdos is gone, Cert behind a sub is a really big problem for Leo's team. But in general, I do think that Haydunn's team really struggles forcing progress into this team. His team is very hazard reliant and it's very Darkrai reliant, and I think that Leo's team matches up really well into that in particular. Speaking of Leo's team and Spin, Tusk, man. I think it looks incredible. Not only is it a great Rapid Spinner this week, with Rapid Spin plus Ice Spinner really scaring that Gliscor away, but offensively, it looks absolutely incredible. I mean, now you do have a little bit of 4 moveset syndrome. I think you want your dual stabs. You want to be able to Rapid Spin, obviously. You want Ice Spinner for the Gliscor, and then you also want either Stone Edge or Supercell Slam. I personally think Stone Edge is a little bit better. You'd probably go Headlong Rush, Stone Edge, Ice Spin, Rapid Spin if you're me in this situation. You can go with an Assault Vest. You can go with an Extra Belt because you hit a lot of things super effectively. You can go with a Booster Energy to hit something really hard with your attack stat boosted and kind of offsetting a little bit of that Intim from the Gyarados potentially. You can even go with a Resist Berry potentially. I really do think that Tusk is incredibly strong in this matchup offensively, and it's just invaluable when it comes to its spinning aspect. I think Bundle probably run Boots here. It flip turns pretty freely on a lot of the switches in. Things like the GlowKing coming in, flip turn, that gives us a free switch into Tusk, opposed to having to try and pivot around those Sludge Bombs and those Psychics and things like that, depending on what we have. So I think that's obviously a great aspect of Bundle. It could also go Specs very viably, but I think that puts a lot of pressure to spin very consistently with Great Tusk, and I think you're in a much better spot if you're using Bundle as a facilitator to get in Tusk this week to do a lot of damage and getting in as much as possible. Now, it does cook with no G-King, though, so if G-King is gone or we whittle it down into a KO range, it might be Bundle time. It does do really well, though. I think Ogerpon has some serious win con potential if the Gouging is chipped. Now, you can rock coverage for Gouging, like Low Kick, Stomping Tantrum, things of the sort, but it's going to be a little bit hard to fit the coverage, and even then, it's going to be hard to even kill it from that range with the Low Kick, so you really do need to whittle it down. But, again, with the hazard pressure that Leo brings in this matchup, with something like Overquill, with getting rocks up even though it's a resisted rock switch in, it's really going to help in whittling down that Gouging, and especially if Haydunn decides to go Assault Vest and goes Gouging on the Bundle, and it continuously peppers it with Ice Beams and Freeze Dries, it's really going to help out that end game for an Ogerpon to potentially Trailblaze up and sweep through the team. I really do think it does really well with just Fire plus Fighting coverage. It can absolutely smash through a team like this, and it also soft checks a SERP, which is always going to be a really good thing, obviously. Big Cinccino also does have really big win potential with something like the Gouging chipped in the back. Again, if we get up with Tidy Up, which is another means of removing hazards, taking pressure off of Great Tusk, we can kind of click Tail Slap into the entire team outside of the Gouging. Gotta be careful of helmets and things like that, but really outside of that, Gouging and maybe Hitmontop, it looks like it's really strong in this matchup in particular. You can go Terra Ground to nuke through the Gouging, or you can just decide, I'm going to kill Gouging, I'm going Terra Normal, hit as hard as possible with my Terra Normal Tail Slaps. So I think that's a really cool option for this. We mentioned too, he has great Darkrai counterplay. I think he has solid SERP counterplay too in Pokemon like Overquill, Zapdos, Ogerpon, and even the Appletun potentially in some instances. Overall, I am going to give this matchup to Leo. I think he has a really strong matchup offensively, and defensively, he pivots into a lot of Haydunn's offense pretty darn easily, and it's really tough for a more balanced hazard stack-oriented team like Haydunn's to force any progress into Leo's here. Alright, next up we have Drewby versus Emvee here. From Drewby's side, I think Hydrapple feels very strong. I think like a Nasty Plot variant looks very solid. Potentially an AV variant or a Haban berry variant for the Raging Bolt, which is a really big issue. Also covers a potential like Dragon move from a Flygon. Feels really powerful. I like it a lot. I think Nasty Plot can really do some work. The biggest threat, though, I think on Drewby's side is going to be that Quacklefall, man. I think it absolutely goes crazy once it gets a boost going with the Moxie and the Aqua Step. Now, of course, we do have to be careful of Raging Bolt, which can Thunderclap us, pretty much knock us out for full, but there are ways around that. We can go Wakan Berry, or we can also go Substitute and try and play around those, or if we eliminate the Raging Bolt in general, it really opens up the Quavo endgame. So I think that's a really clutch aspect of this Pokemon. I think there is ways around the Raging Bolt, despite it being a pretty big stopgap in that Sucker Punch, but it adds some really stressful 50-50s that I think could be really fun to watch. I think Rillaboom looks really strong with a Band. I mean, Banded Woodhammer might be one of the freest moves of all time in this matchup. Now, we do have something like Pheasantipity, but it really does not appreciate a Banded Woodhammer. I think you'd be surprised at how much damage that thing took. Banded Glide is always a nice thing to have in a matchup, and then beyond that, you just go U-turn and either knock off or high horsepower seem very solid. So Very strong Pokemon here in general. Screamtail is going to be a big issue in this matchup for Emvee to either break with some kind of encoring Thunder Waving variant. You can go Cassibberry in order to take on, or at least initially pivot into something like Annihilate and encore it into a setup move, or do a little bit of damage with some Psychic or anything like that. It's also a solid rocker in the matchup. Encore just feels very strong to this team in general when you have things like the Raging Bolt, when you have things like the Empoleon, the Mew, the Farigiraf. A lot of these things really don't appreciate being locked in. But another thing I was talking with my buddy Emil about, he said that he thought a Calm Minding Screamtail looked very, very strong here, and I'd have to agree, honestly. A booster energy set with Calm Mind 3 attacks could really be a big nuisance to this team, not only in killing, but also dealing with if it really starts getting some boosts going. So really solid set here, potentially, is a more offensive Screamtail. And then, yeah, overall, some other solid picks. Things like Boulder can definitely sweep in the end game with a Swords Dance up and a close combat going. Mostly close combat over Earthquake because, one, we don't have to worry about our terrain, but two, it covers like a Terra Steel Flygon, and it hits the Empo a little bit harder. You do kind of struggle with initially killing Fez unless you're Psychic coverage, but I guess you definitely go Psychic coverage in this game, right? You're definitely not running no Psychic coverage into the 8 matchup. So if some things get chipped and we're in a good spot, we can set up with that Boulder, get a booster speed and a +2 attack going and really do some damage. Now, as for Emvee's side, I think Ape absolutely demolishes this team with any bulk up variant. I think Resto Chesto is probably the best set here, in my personal opinion, because it is going to get very whittled. There are some potential status ailments that can come across us, like Flame Body or Lava Plume Heatran, Thunder Waving Screamtail, Thunder Waving Thunderous, Glare, Sandaconda. There's a lot of para in general. Will-O-Wisping Frostlass is another option. So I think potentially going Resto Chesto, being able to get back up to full, shake off any status conditions, boost up our Outrageous, and potentially win the game. I think Bolt looks really strong. The ground type in Sandaconda is not the sturdiest thing, especially defensively, and it can obviously Terra, so Volt Switch seems very, very free, and whittling things down like Heatran is always going to be really clutch for the rest of our team, because Heatran is actually a big nuisance to this team, I think, especially in the ways of Weavile, which also does really well. I think a Banded variant is a great way of forcing progress. You can also be a little bit more safe and go with like a Protective Pad set to really not have to deal with any Rocky Helmets with your Triple Axle, or have to deal with Flame Body from Heatran, as that is a very, very viable option from Drewby here to go Rocky Helmet with the Flame Body, really trying to cripple that Weavile before it can get anything going. You can go with Knockoff, Triple Axle, Ice Shard, and the last move can either be Ice Spinner to get rid of Terrain, it can be Low Kick to get rid of the Heatran from a higher amount. There's plenty of options for it, in my opinion. Fez or Empo seems like it needs to take on Scream, because other than that, it's really difficult for this team to deal with it. I think Empoleon in particular is probably going to be the answer, because obviously Fez does take a little bit of chip from Psychics and things like that. Though if you're Spadef, you kind of eat Screamtail alive. It's not known for being very offensive. So, and again, another thing to keep in mind in that regards. Steel doesn't resist Rock on Emvee's team, in the sense that Heatran is the Steel type. So we can rock out with like a Choice Scarf or a Choice Band Cleavor to not only get up rocks, but really do a lot of damage. Other than that, the rock resist is Quackleval, which isn't the sturdiest thing in the world, and it's really one coverage move away from getting absolutely rocked. You can really just go with like Stone Axe, U-Turn, Close Combat, and then maybe even just Exeter, because Exeter also feels very powerful in this matchup. It really is not that bad, and getting it out cost and like Rillaboom is good. You can also go with an Aerial Ace to nuke the Quackleval with a super effective coverage move, a little bit more neutral coverage. But yeah, definitely a really, really strong Pokemon here. But overall, oh, and sorry, dude, I'm totally tripping. I apologize. There's one more thing I really want to mention, was Mew offensively. I think does really, really well. I would probably go with a Dragon Dance variant, but I think Nasty Plot has some viability as well. But a Dragon Dance set, despite having pretty bad Formuthought syndrome, it really can do a ton of work. You can rock out with Ice coverage, I think is needed either in Triple Axle or Ice Spinner, again, to get rid of Terrain. You can rock out with Close Combat, and then probably Psychic Fangs as Stab for your last move. Honestly, you can kind of DD up and Triple Axle through a lot of the Psychic and Fighting resist on this team, so I definitely think that's a very, very viable option as a win condition, as things like Screamtail are whittled down and chipped down, as things like Boulder are whittled down and chipped down, as you don't necessarily Oko them with those moves. But if you can find the position to set up a DD, you're probably Lumberry on the thing as well for all the status that we mentioned earlier, and the 3 Thunderwave Mons, the 2 Wisping Mons, and the Flame Body Heatran, I definitely think that Mew can put in a lot of work. Overall, I am going to roll with Emvee in this matchup. I think that his offense is just a little bit too overwhelming for Drewby, and it's going to be hard. Drewby's really going to have to outplay around things like Raging Bolt with a lot of his offense in order to have a chance at winning this. So, yeah, going to take Emvee here. Next up, we have Chimpact versus CBAD here. Now, from Chimpact's side, I think Nasty Plot Torn looks pretty solid. I think AV is also very valid, and in the sense that it like pivots into Pokemon. Like Hisui Lilligant naturally, it'll take a spinner from full, but also it'll take a hit from things like Specs Wake and things like that, provided you can keep hazards away, which is a little bit tough. So that's why I kind of lean with like a boot set, maybe Nasty Plot, maybe just 4 attacks with U-turn. That's also a very valid option here, but overall it's a great pivot, and it's really strong offensively here in my opinion, between Bleakwind, Heat Wave, and Grass Knot, just whether or not you want to go U-turn or a Nasty Plot in that 4th slot. Now, Fizdef Dozo seems like a requirement, and is something like Gouging, right? Because other than that, the Gouging gets a DD up, and it can kind of just win the video game. Now, we'll talk about it a little bit better, a little bit later, there are definitely Gouging sets that can kind of push through Dozo, and really open up this team, but I definitely think you at least want Dozo in general to pivot into that. An offensive Pokemon that again does really well on Chimpact's side is going to be Hisui and Arcanine. You think, well, duh, it gives Sun, so you just click Flare Blitz, but no, I think the biggest bane is it keep clicking Head Smash in this matchup. The Steel type doesn't resist Rock, the Ground type is not the bulkiest thing in the world, and if you're clicking Choice Band Head Smash, there's not much that's taking you on. Now you can go Scarf as well, but I think Choice Band is a little bit better, because having that Choice Band Extreme Speed option is really strong, and a lot of the Pokemon that you want to outspeed with the Scarf are already going to outspeed you when they either get boosted outside of Gouging, once they get boosted, or once they're in the sun with either Chlorophyll or Photosynthesis. So I think that Band is actually a little bit stronger. You can use your Natural Bulk as well to take hits from things you might need to, and really just click Head Smash, Flare Blitz, and Extreme Speed the entire game for little to no drawback. So it looks really, really strong. Ting-Lu seems great here. It hazard stacks really, really well. Gets up spikes, can Ruination things down, and it also checks Hoopa, which is a big issue to the team otherwise as a breaker. So I really, really like the Ting-Lu in this matchup in particular. I think Ogerpon and Comfey are going to be your best ways of trying to deal with Walking Wake, in the sense that you're immune to each of its stabs, so choice variants are going to have a little bit tougher of a time, but you really do have to guess correctly each and every time, and Comfey also isn't the best in general this game, so you really might not see Comfey come in general, and it might be more of an offensive approach to beating something like the Walking Wake on a team like this, maybe having something like AV Hands pivot in once. If it Dracos and it's -2, you go into Ogre. If it Water moves, you go into Ogre, things like that, but you definitely don't want to take a really strong Draco Meteor on your Ogerpon. It's going to do a lot of damage, to be completely honest. You got to be really, really careful about that. I think Reverum is going to be the best win condition from Chimpact's side this week. I think Terra Fire Shift Gear is so incredibly strong. If something like Lilligant Under the Sun doesn't come to potentially prevent us, once this thing gets up a Shift Gear, it turns into a Fire type and resists a ton of moves on the opposing side, as well as burns from Will-O-Wisp and Lava Plumes and things like that, and Burning Bulwarks. I think it can just win the game straight up on its own. It's going to be very strong. There's going to be a few Pokemon that you want to chip down prior, obviously, in Pokemon like the Walking Wake. You want to make sure it's taking a little bit of Hazard Chip so it's in range of a +1 attack. You're going to want to make sure that the Sandy Shocks is in range of a +1 attack. But really, other than that, you just have to worry about Lilligant Under Sun. And if Lilligant doesn't come, I mean, it's really going to go to town here. I think Reverum looks incredibly strong, and it's kind of showing why it's probably the best Terra Captain allowed in the league, in my personal opinion. AV or SD Hands look strong. I would probably go Assault Vest in this matchup. You can go with Drain Punch, Thunder Punch, Heavy Slam, and then either Volt Switch or Earthquake as your last move slot. Really looks super, super solid. Heavy Slam is for that Weezing in particular. Obviously, Weezing is going to potentially be Levitate. I think it's probably Neutralizing Gas, but Levitate is a very viable option here as well to check things like EQ Hands and check things like Ting-Lu really well and check things like DDD Knight really well. So if it is Levitate, Heavy Slam actually does more. It's full 120 base power from Hands into Weezing, and is an easy 2-hit KO on that thing. So it's a great way of potentially catching it off guard, whittling it down, getting rid of it, and really helping out the rest of your team. So I think that's definitely a cover tool if you want. Special D-Knight is a great option. I think Dragon Dance can do some work, but I don't think it's the best. I think a special variant looks really strong, either with boots with your multi-scale, or potentially running a Haban Berry in order to lure both the Gouging Fire and the Walking Wake, hit them hard with a Draco Meteor, pretty much knock them out guaranteed, and put yourself in a pretty good spot. That plus like Flamethrower is really, really strong into this opposing side, so definitely a good Pokemon overall. Overall, though, I think Chimp seems really versatile. I think there's viability from literally every single one of his Pokemon. I think Comfey is probably the worst in that regard. Maybe Drifloon's a little bit worse because Revavroom is so good as a Terra Captain, but really, he could go a million different Pokemon and build a very cohesive team. I'm really impressed with his draft so far when I was looking at this matchup. Now, that doesn't mean CBAD doesn't have some threats on his team. First up, I think that Banded Gouging has huge potential to really, really break a hole in this team. Something like the Dondozo is not going to, allow him to sweep with the Dragon Dance variant, at least until the Dozo is gone. I think a much more reliable means of this thing is getting it in on the slower threats, or the threats that don't really threaten Gouging offensively with an Oko, getting it in early and clicking Banded attacks, especially because Comfey cannot come in on the Gouging. You have very free Dragon moves throughout the entirety of this game. So if that's the case, you can kind of click Dragon into everything. Again, something like Revavroom is not coming in on a Banded Gouging fire. It's not really known for its defensive steel qualities. And if we're doing that, we're breaking through Dozo. And if we break through Dozo, then we kill everything else with our fire moves, right? So that's obviously something to keep in mind. I think that Banded is great. I think Shock should come as like a spiker, get up as many spikes as humanly possible. Chimp doesn't have any removal on his team, at least as far as I can bet. Now, he might stack some boots because of that, and believe me, I am a heavy-duty boots stan. I will spam it on all 6 mons if I need to, but it's also very valuable information in that regards, in the sense that we're forcing constant chip otherwise, or we're, making it to where Pokemon don't have great items otherwise, which is kind of the opportunity cost of boots here. So I think Shox is great as a spiker. Wake is an absolute nuke here. Again, I don't think you want to go choice just because there are 2 immunities to your stabs, but some kind of Life Orb variant, or some kind of booster variant outside of the sun, or some kind of Life Orb variant looks really, really strong and breaking through this team. So I think the dual Dragon Protomons look really strong with spikes. I think you really, really want Wheezing with Helmet, plus potentially Neutralizing Gas over Levitate. I know it makes you a little bit weaker to hands, potentially, as well as the Tinglu and the Dragonite, but I like Neutralizing Gas to help whittle down that Arcanine, right? If we take away its Rock Head when we switch it, and the Helmet is there, it's going to do a lot of damage to us, but it's essentially going to eliminate Arcanine from contention. It's not going to be a Pokemon anymore. It also soft checks a lot of the physical offense, things like Hands, things like D-Knight, things like Ogre, things like Rev. It will take a hit from, and you'll be able to deal with somewhat accordingly, depending. Not really Rev, because it's going to tear fire, it's going to set up on you, and that's a little scary. But there are anti-setup options on Wheezing, obviously, but makes it a little bit scary. I do think the Sun is kind of needed. Despite Ninetales not being the best Pokemon in the world, I think setting up the Sun for Wake and Lilligant, and which we'll talk about in a second, and Gouging is almost a requirement. I also love it for Shocks. So despite Ninetales not being great, I think you should bring it. And then the last one can be either something like Hoopa, which struggles a little bit in my opinion, Miss Magius, which is a solid Terra Captain in this matchup, or Corviknight. No, I think Corviknight's actually really bad here. I think it sucks a lot of momentum. I think the entirety of the team has potential to beat down Corviknight big time. I think it should be Hisui and Lilligant, in all honesty. With Chlorophyll, if we get that Sun up with our Ninetales, we're not in constant fear of just raw losing to Revavroom when it shift gears up. And the Terra typing that it's going to turn into in Fire, most likely, I'd be very surprised to see not Fire, is still going to get hit very, very hard by a close combat. So if we can at least chip into range of a close combat, come in with a Life Orb Lilligant, and just click Chlorophyll, just click a Life Orb boosted close combat with our Chlorophyll boost in the Sun. It's going to be great. It's also anti-setup in the sense that it's going to outspeed DDD Knights and, a bunch of different things. I think just like a Life Orb, close combat, Leaf Blade, Ice Spinner, 4th move set is going to be really, really strong here in this matchup in particular. Though I am going to go Chimpact. I said it before, I think his team's just so versatile. I think he has so many big threats that he can go for. I think it's really hard for CBAD to kind of match that in the sense of where he only has really 6 viable Pokemon in this matchup, in my opinion, maybe 7 with Miss Mag. Chimpact has like 9. So that's obviously a really, really scary thing. So I am going to lean at Chimp in week 1. Alright, for our next matchup, we have Joey Pokeaimmd versus ShadyPenguin in a really, really exciting matchup. And man, can I just say, it is really fun to see Big Billy as the first slot right there. Now, starting from Joey's side, I think that his physical offense is really, really overwhelming in this matchup. What I mean is something like Landorus is going to be a great check to Pokemon like Cinderace, like Scizor, like Lycanroc Dusk, especially if it's more physically defensive with a Rocky Helmet, which we'll talk about later. I do think it's going to be. But when we have the combination of these Pokemon clicking clicking a ton and ton of attacks into these, it makes them very, very difficult to deal with. In particular, Cinderace plus Lycanroc is very, very overwhelming in this matchup, as well as something like Scizor. If we just come in and we're clicking Pyro Ball and U-Turn, and then we're clicking Stone Edge and Assail Rock and Close Combat, and then we're coming in with our Scissor and we're clicking Bullet Punch and U-Turn and Close Combat. It's really going to get incredibly overwhelming for Shady's team because the main two checks in something like Landorus and Rotom don't really have a way of staying healthy in this matchup. Rotom can Pain Split, obviously, but Landorus in particular, man, I think it's really going to want to be Helmet to really punish these Pokemon coming in constantly and clicking U-Turn, all of the momentum-based offense that Joey has here, and it's just going to get whittled down over the course of the game. And if it's not Helmet, it's just going to get U-Turned on for free the entire game. And then a threat that deals with it aptly and accordingly is going to come in afterwards. So I think that's a really, really big aspect to this matchup. I think Latias also looks great offensively. Really only Grimmsnarl can take on his dual stab combination. And then when you take into account the fact that Latias finally got fairy coverage this gen in Alluring Voice, oh man, if it catches that Grimmsnarl one time with that coverage, it's going to be really difficult for it to even switch into neutral moves afterwards, moves like Ice Beam, which are very likely. Other than that, Psychics and Dracos are going to reign supreme and just click and do a ton of damage. So I really like the offensive Lottie potentially coming through here. Potentially Scarf is what I'm thinking personally, but definitely looks really, really solid in this matchup. I think Hazard Attack is a great thing here. Qwilfish is going to be really difficult to remove on in the sense that the Rapid Spinner in Serena gets absolutely walled by Qwilfish. Qwilfish is going to stuff that thing. Now, Serena can knock it off, which is annoying, but it's not like Qwilfish doesn't check it after the UV light is knocked off anyways, and we can just spike up after it spins anyways, right? So there's not really a reason to bring Rapid Spin Serena, and it might honestly just keep Serena on the bench because of that. There's really no way it can ever get away those hazards unless we're playing with them up the whole game, Qwilfish gets sacked, and then we Rapid Spin. But even then, how long were those spikes up, and how much did your team get whittled down, obviously? Diancie is another potential hazards option, but I think Serena spins on a little easier, so we're probably not going to see that as the hazard setter from Joey's side. I think Perch solid defensively as well. It's going to check a ton of things like Sneasler, things like Lando, things like Orchaladon. It's going to always take a hit from things like Magmortar, unless it's like, Power Herb Solar Beam set. It's going to absolutely munch and eat from. So I think it's a great Pokemon defensively as well. And then, of course, we have to kind of think and how do we get Big Billy to do well? I think this is a matchup where it can. I don't know if I would personally bring it, but with Terra Normal, Guts boosted normal type attacks with spikes up, it could be strong. Terra Ground for the Archaladon? I don't know. There is potential. The physical offense is overwhelmed. We spam that, and then we come with Big Billy later with all the hazards up. I mean, I don't know. He might do it. But from Shady's side, I think the best Pokemon in this matchup from his perspective is going to be Sneasler. Not the typical setup win Sneasler. I think Choice Band looks really strong. It outspeeds everything naturally on this team outside of Scarfers, and it hits everything incredibly hard. Close Combat, Dire Claw, U-Turn, it 2 KOs or OKOs the entire squad. It just absolutely nukes them. Pokemon like Swampert get 2 KO by Band in Close Combat, and it also really punishes more passive switches trying to stop setup sets and things like that. It also punishes people staying in to not let the Sneasler set up for free. Now, setup is an option, but really, I feel like you should just come in and click Close Combat the whole game. Even if Latias comes in, it's taking a Banded Close Combat, and it's going to potentially get poisoned, and if Rocks are up, I mean, it's taking a lot of damage right there, and that means next time, it can't switch in anymore. So I really do like Banded Sneasler a lot. I mentioned it before, I think a Landorus is really required. Landorus plus Rotom is a really solid defensive core in this matchup. Probably Helmet Landorus plus like a Pain Splitting, Will-O-Wisping Rotom is probably the route you go here. I also think that Grimmsnarl is a necessity, not necessarily in the screens so my team can set up and win sense. I think it's better as a parting shot pivot, T-waving things, and then just being a good Latias check. I think Spadef is going to be your best bet at checking Lottie, and it can also sponge hits from things like Thunderous and hit it hard with a Play Rough or a Spirit Break if that's, what you end up wanting to do here. I think Magmortar also feels very strong with Terra Fairy outside of the Swampert, which is liable to get you down by things like Sneasler and Landorus and Rotom potentially. Terra Fairy is very strong. Fire Fairy is obviously perfect coverage offensively, and it really shows here. You can tech on things like Scorching Sands for the few, for the Cinderace and the Lycanroc. You can be able to burn on them, and then you can even go with that Power Herb Solar Beam set. You could go with a ton of different options. I really do like Magmortar. You can go double Fire Stab and like Overheat plus Flamethrower. There's definitely a lot of cool things you can do with this guy here. And then Azelf also looks pretty strong once something like Qwilfish goes down, and it's definitely going to be in early trying to get up spikes, so it's not too difficult of a task to chip down that Qwilfish and open up an Azelf endgame, or open up Azelf in general as a breaker, so something else can win in the endgame. But Overall, I am going to lean Joey in this matchup. I think his physical offense is just so imposing here. I think Latias is so imposing. I think spikes are going to be infinite. It's going to be really difficult for Shady's team to deal with this, in my opinion. So we're going to lean Joey. Next up, we have Uzi versus Gator. And can I just mention how disgusting Uzi's team is? By the way, I don't think you guys realize how insane his top three and really all of his supporting cast is. And speaking of his top three, Pulp looks really, really strong here. I think you probably want to go with some kind of Boots Will-O-Wisping variant just to annoy Samurott. I think Samurot's going to be a big kind of centerpiece to Gator's defensive outlook on how to beat, this really, really scary special offense at the top and Pult Chiyu. AV checks both of them well, and if we can cripple that thing with a burn, we're in a really, really good position in lowering its damage output, as well as crippling it and chipping it down and, putting in range of our Pult, but more importantly, our Chiyu, which looks incredible afterwards. You probably want to rock with the Scarf variant this week, but Dual Styles plus Psychic looks incredibly strong here. Probably just Flamethrower, Dark Pulse, Overheat, Psychic is what I would probably run. Scarf, again, looks very strong. Runs some speed ties, but also outspeeds a lot of the offense on the opposing side, and really just kind of pushes through things with hazard support, as well as things like Pult and, things like that. I think Treads is a great means of keeping away hazards, threatening Goldango. Now, Goldango can be a Rocky Helmet, an Air Balloon variant, obviously avoiding both the Rapid Spin and the Earthquake, but still gets popped by Ironhead. It still gets popped by a very obvious knockoff potentially coming, and knockoff is going to be great for Haunter, also trying to potentially spin block on Gator's side. So I think that Treads is actually a great spinner in this game, and having a good spinner into into Goldango Samurott is insanely valuable for Uzi, so I love that. Azu looks great with an AV or a helmet to punish the Samurott. I don't think it's going to be the Samurott response necessarily. I think Shaman's actually a little bit better at that, because that allows our Azu to go potentially like an Assault Vest variant and check things like Keldeo really well. Soft check things like the Goldango decently. Really hit the opposing team hard as well. Our Dual Stabs plus like Ice just absolutely smokes the opposing side, and Knockoff is obviously very strong. Gets rid of items, is a big nuisance. Solid Pokemon. Bandit is also a very valuable aspect too. I think Bandit could definitely come in this game, which is cool. I mentioned Shaman. I think it's a good check too. A lot of the physical offense on the opposing side. I think Seed Flare, Dazzling Gleam, Earth Power, Synth is probably a really solid, potential set in this game in particular. You probably definitely want the Earth Power too for the Iron Moth in case you can catch that thing. But with a helmet, you're going to check things like Zarude. You're going to go ahead and check things like the Samurott very well. And while Samurott might be getting up spikes against you, you'll be threatening it out. You'll be getting damage off on something. And again, you have good spin on this team, which is really big. And then lastly, I like Dio defensively. It seems great. It's very sturdy. It's a great response into something like Dio or into something like the Iron Moth, which can be a big problem. Something like the Keldeo, which can be a big problem if we go a more offensive Azu. So I think like a SPL variant could be great. I think a spiking variant in particular is great. Probably some kind of night shading set. Really does do a lot of work for Uzi's team. Now, for Gator here, I think Goldango seems really strong. Balloons for Treads is solid, but I think more than likely a Scarf should come, in my opinion. I think it has great revenge killing potential on things like Pult, on things like non-Scarf Chiyu, on things like Treads after a little bit of chip. Does a ton of damage to Dio, and it can trick some of the more passive fat things like the Dio coming in and wanting to take that hit. Things like the Oki setting up, things like the Azu if it's an AV variant, something like that. Could be very nice to trick. And again, it's just an overall really strong Pokemon. The Ghost Resist on the team are Alolan Persian and Chiyu, which isn't the strongest thing in the world. So maybe less so the trick and more so just Goldango being really strong offensively in this matchup, I guess. I think Samurott can be Scarf as well, but as we mentioned before, I think Assault Vest is probably your best variant. Assault Vest or some kind of Lumberry variant to avoid burns from most top 2 threats that you're kind of trying to come in on in check and things like that. But again, you're forcing progress for your team. You're getting up spikes while attacking, which is just such a stupid concept. And again, you're also checking a lot of the special offense on the opposing side. Also checks the Galarian Articuno, which I think is really important as well. So lots of pressure on Big Sam right here. I really do think AV should probably come here. I think hazards plus guys like Keldeo and Moth also exert a ton of pressure. I already mentioned it. From the Samurott, you get those hazards up. Then mons like Iron Moth and mons like Keldeo don't have as sturdy of switch-ins when you have Pokemon like Deoxys. Now, and again, that might force Deoxys to run Boots, which means it's not leftover, which means it's recovering more, which means it's running out of recovers more, and it lets you force progress quicker. So I I really do like the hazards potentially from Gator side, really opening up a ton of his offense, which is great. And I think the Dunsparce can also come to check Dragapult. It's just a little bit worse than the rest of the team, in my opinion, but it does take a lot of pressure off the Samurott, letting that thing check Chi-Yu potentially, letting the Dunsparce check the Pulp. Coming in, it's also going to be a better Wisp Absorber, especially if you go a special variant, so that's obviously really cool. And I think an SD Trailblazer Root is a very, very viable and possible endgame. Really, you only need dual stabs if you chip things down sufficiently. Something like Chi-Yu isn't going to appreciate a +2 Power Whip, right? And really nothing else on the team actually takes the dual stabs well outside of Okidogi, and I don't think Oki is actually great here, and to be completely honest, I think offensive sets are very, very mediocre in this matchup. I think defensively, it's not the greatest either. It doesn't really have a set purpose outside of checking the Zarude. So if you can pressure that thing, get up hazards again, you're in a pretty good spot. Overall, I am going to go with Uzi in this matchup. I think that the Pulp plus Chi-Yu just looks way too strong with all the hazard control and support that he has, and great pivots on the bottom end. So I am going to go Uzi in this matchup, but I think it could definitely go either way. Next up, we have PlayMore Esports versus Nexus in his brand new Toronto Tyrants here. Now, from Playmore's side, I think Valiant looks very, very strong. I think a special set is probably best. You can rock out with a spec set, or if you're worried about webs, you can go with some boots in order to not have your speed dropped and become really a non-factor. But if you look at your dual stabs plus Vacuum Wave, there really isn't great pivots at all outside of things like Talonflame, which you can just rock a Thunderbolt for and blow up. Now, there is the issue of Jirachi. Jirachi is pretty specially defensive and good at checking it, but with all the hazards pressure you have, I think Focus Blast, or if you want to tech on Shadow Ball, is more than enough to be able to whittle that thing down into 2-hit KO or OHKO range. Now, next up is Garchomp, and the ground resist on the opposing side is Meowscarada. Now, there are a few immunities, but they aren't known for being the bulkiest Pokemon, so I think offensively, Garchomp looks incredible. Now, you can go with an SD variant, but I personally like either Scarf or, more than that even, a Banded set a ton. If we have pivots like general bulky waters like Blastoise coming in, they're going to come in and take 65% from your Earthquake and just get 2-hit KO'd and blown up. If you can catch that Talonflame with one Rock Slide, Stone Edge, or Dragon Claw, it's going to be a dead Pokemon. If you have no Enamorus, Outrage and Dragon Claw are incredibly free as well. So I really think like a Banded Garchomp could do a lot of work. There's also some great value and merit in a more defensive variant and like a Rocky Helmet and Endure set to really try and punish a lot of these physical attackers, things like Meowscarada and Talonflame. The only issue is Meow can just knock you the first time it comes in and then axle you the next time, but you will get off residual with your Ruskin regardless, so that could be nice, but I do think it's a waste of Garchomp's talents in this game. I think offensively it's so unbelievably strong. Metagross is a great check to a lot of Nexus's offense, in particular his special offense core of Kyurem and Enamorus. It can stuff both of them pretty darn well. Now, it has a lot of pressure on it to stuff both of them, but it's also very hard for Nexus, in my opinion, to fit both of them. We'll talk about that a little bit later. So whichever of the two is more likely to come, you will check very well with an Assault Vest, and there is potential Wish, passing into you from that Vaporeon to keep you healthy, which is obviously very nice. Amoonguss serves as a solid Meow check and Enam pivot as well. Now, obviously, Triple Axle is going to 2-hit KO you, but again, if we're AV, or if we're Rocky Helmet, or getting residual chip on that thing, it's coming in, it's taking damage every time it attacks you, you're whittling it down in the range of things like Bullet Punch Metagross, Vacuum Wave, Valiant, putting it guaranteed range of a Terra Fairy Hisui Electrode, into range of a Shadow Sneak potentially, even if it's not in its, if it's not a dark type anymore, because of Protean is what I'm trying to say. So I actually think that Amoonguss is probably your better pivot into that Pokemon, and you can throw off Spores, be annoying with Sludge Bombs, and again, you pivot well into a couple other Pokemon on this team. If you're physically defensive, you'll take non-Guts boosted Ursaluna hits pretty well and be able to pivot into it and stop it if it's like a Swords Dance or a Swords Dance or a Bulk Up variant or something of the sort. So that's obviously very nice in my opinion. I think both Terra Captains look incredible. I would personally go with Electrode. I think Terra Fairy Volts forever. It clicks really strong. Energy Balls or Leaf Storms on the one immunity in Ursaluna, which doesn't switch it into it very well. And then we have Terra Fairy to hit a lot of things very hard. It hits the Grass super effectively in Meowscarada. It hits the Dragon super effectively in Kyurem, and hits a lot of things incredibly hard. It also gives you pretty much guaranteed speed control the entire game. Having something faster than Meowscarada is absolutely incredible. So I'd probably go Trode here, but that doesn't mean Glacier isn't incredibly strong as well. Again, with Terra Fairy, it can be pretty strong offensively into this team. Really, what is going to break it down, I guess, something like Jirachi, but even then, Glashier's bulky enough to kind of just eat that thing up, to where you can go with the Swords Dance variant, you can go with a more bulky resting variant to check things like the Meowscarada a little bit better, especially if you're a Rocky Helmet set and you get your Terra off and things like that. So I definitely think that Glacier has some great value and merit in this matchup. I would personally go Trode, but Glacier is really, really solid in that regard. And then other than that, yeah, I think Jugu has some value as well. I think like a booster speed set could do pretty okay, just because of the fact that it outspeeds the entirety of the opponent's team outside of Scarf Meowscarada, which would be definitely a pretty crazy bring. But other than that, you can kind of come in, you can click Hurricane, Flash Cannon, Dark Pulse, and really do a lot of work to the opposing side and potentially function as a win condition later in the game. Now, from Nexus' side, Meowscarada goes crazy. We've kind of been talking about it. The combination of dark grass and ice looks really, really strong into the opposing side. There really isn't anything that pivots into that in the game in general, and it feels really strong in particular right here, to be completely honest. I think non-choice is probably the best, just so we can switch up our moves and really threaten some things. You can potentially go with a protective pad set, in my opinion, and put in a lot of work that way. Scarf has some merit, Band also has some merit because it's so damn strong, but just something to keep in mind. I think Kyurem or Enamor should probably come, not both, because I think the team's stretched a little thin to have both of those guys. But one or the other can really force its own progress really well. If we catch the Metagross once with an Earth Power on both of those guys, we're going to do a ridiculous amount of damage, chip it down to where we can potentially just click Moonblast or Ice Beam later in the game, probably with the Specs if I had to guess, or Boots on both work. Now, Luna also looks really, really strong. I think Swords Dance or Assault Vest looks really, really great. I like Swords Dance with a Chople Berry a ton here. Being able to lure that Valiant coming in trying to revenge you after you killed something after an SD is really, really valuable, because that thing goes absolutely crazy. And if you look at the opposing side, I don't think there's a single Pokemon on PlayMore's team that can OHKO a Ursaluna. There doesn't seem to be literally anything. So there's plenty of Swords Dance potential coming in, clicking SD, and nuking something, and potentially going really fast too, outspeeding something like Amoonguss, Glastrier, Vaporeon if they're not running any speed. Outspeeding those guys entirely would be ridiculously valuable and make this thing a big threat here. I think Blastoise is going to be great at keeping hazards away, and is going to be needed to keep hazards away. The Spin Blocker does not want to come in and take a Surf, so it's not going to come in and take a Surf. Other than that, we're just probably going to Rapid Spin, keep hazards away, soft check Pokemon like Garchomp and Valiant if we can. Same thing with Glastrier, unless it's electric. I think it can tear electric in this matchup, so there's something to keep in mind in general. I do think it's very solid. Rachi and Talonflame serve as great checks and pivots into Valiant. Again, you gotta be careful. You're just one coverage move away from kind of getting blown up or chipped really, really low, but it is kind of the best you can do against that. And then both Terra Captains on Nexus side seem kind of mediocre in this matchup. I think Toxic is the best of the two, but they seem very difficult to fit in this matchup in general, and kind of take away a very important team slot from one of the other top 7 Pokemon that we have already mentioned. And Frogadier's not coming, guys, unfortunately. It would be funny to bring Frogadier into the Frog team, but I don't think it's coming. Overall, I am going to lean Playmore over Nexus in this game. I think Nexus has some tools, but Playmore's team is just so disgusting, man. Valiant, Garchomp, Metagross is... everybody in the league needs to go to jail after letting them get this, but yeah, I'm going to go Playmore here. And for our last matchup of the day, we have ShuckleKing versus KyleAye. Now, from ShuckleKing's perspective, Blood Moon looks incredibly powerful. I mean, it always does, right? It's an incredibly strong Pokemon with pretty much unresisted Dual Stab. And into Kyle's team in particular, I don't see much great counterplay for Blood Moon and Earth Power. It really does do a ridiculous amount of damage. Maybe some kind of Clefable with Calm Mind could potentially deal with it. Especially if you're Calm Mind unaware to deal with a potential Calm Mind Ursaluna. That definitely makes a little bit of sense, especially because your opponent can't Blood Moon twice, so as long as you can live Blood Moon into Earth Power, you should be mostly okay. Now, I'm not 100% sure on those calcs, to be completely honest, and you're probably forced into a Wish variant, as you can't really Moonlight in the Sun and Rain matchup, and that's kind of a big crux of Clefable on Kyle's team in general if he ever decides to bring Sand. So that's something to keep in mind. It's probably his best set. It's probably just some kind of Wish, Protect, Moonblast, unaware variant that can also potentially Calm Mind up and do some damage, but you could also rock with another move potentially, not too big of a deal. I think Grant also looks incredible as well. Outside of Tentacle, Dual Stab plus Sludge Wave just smokes. And even then, Tentacle has stayed really healthy. And even then, Tentacle's not going to OHKO Greninja from full, right? It's a Tentacruel. Maybe with Mirror Coat you will, but that's a bit of a risky call, obviously, in some instances. So I think Greninja, if that Tentacle doesn't come or is whittled down, and obviously the Clefable is whittled down, which it probably will if you're using Blood Moon correctly or Baxcalibur correctly, you're probably going to have a good time with your Grand, potentially an endgame, with a Battle Bond variant. Now, Lottie and Drill are covered pretty well on this team, to be completely honest, between Hatterene, Bronzong, and Rain. I think there's a lot of good potential answers into Kyle's offense on Shuckle Squad. It's actually really, really difficult for something like Drill Understand to do work, which you can't go Molt Breaker, obviously. That's all fine and dandy, but then you're not having that speed advantage that you really, really want into a team like this. Plus, even if you got that sand advantage, you got rid of the Bronzong, there's still the whole rain aspect you have to deal with Pelipper plus Ludicolo. Like, there really is a lot of pressure on this Drill. And then Latios also, you know, is pretty well checked by the dual Psychic Core, as well as good offensive ways of revenging it, like Greninja and Ice Shard Baxcalibur. So he has really, really good counterplay to Shuckle's top end of his offense. When you have Lottie Sand, that's typically going to be what the team functions around. If those guys don't have a great matchup, it's going to be a difficult time. I think Terra Kilowattrel smokes. It does really well. The only real pivots into that thing right now are going to be something like the Tyranitar, which just gets you turned on and whittled down over the course of the game. I think you could just go like Thunderbolt, Hurricane, Terra Blast, Water, and absolutely smoke through this team. Do really, really well with this Pokemon. So Killer does great. I think Baxcalibur isn't great with a Dragon Dance variant, just because it's a little slow. You're playing into sand, things like that, and you're playing into Underwear, Clefable potentially. But I think Banded does really well, because it's a great revenge option for Weaken Drill, for Lottie, for Ogerpon, things like that can get really scary. But also, it's really strong, man. You're going to break through Clefable. There's also not great ice resist on Kyle's team physically, defensive-wise. When it comes to something like Tentacruel, Tentacruel is not the most physically bulky Pokemon. Let's check something, actually. I'm curious. Baxcalibur. If we get up to +1 attack, let's say we're Icicle Crash and not Spear, because we're not running loaded dice, right? Icicle Crash into a max HP Tentacruel. You do 48% with an Adamant Banded Icicle Crash, which means any other move you click is obviously going to nuke this thing. You can just go Crash, Glaive Rush, Ice Shard, Earthquake, and absolutely smoke through this team with Baxcalibur. So I really like the Banded variant a ton in this matchup. I think it does really well. I think Mienshao can be great as a pivot into a lot of the sand, in particular the T-Tar, because if you come in on the T-Tar, you're going to be able to U-turn out. Drill can't come in. We're not making uses of those sand turns, and that's unfortunate, obviously. And then Glim offensively looks really good. I don't think it's great as a hazard stacker in this game, just because Drill gets pretty free spins off potentially. But I do think that it is really, really strong offensively with its dual status plus earth power. I think a rock polish variant could actually potentially really win the game, to be completely honest. So looks really strong. Now, as for Kyle's side, like I said before and kind of alluded to, this might be a Mold Breaker Drill matchup. Otherwise, Zong stuffs you and an aggressive Hatterene punishes you and passes back rocks potentially, which could be really annoying. Now, I don't think that's going to happen. It's mostly for the Bronzong, but I think in particular, you're probably going to want to rock out with some kind of Mold Breaker Stealth Rocking set with Earthquake, maybe some rock coverage for that Pelipper. And yeah, definitely a solid Pokemon at the very least. And that utility role is just not going to do what you want on Drill Sand, where it is, you know, the main offensive breaker or win condition or whatever it is. I think Tentacruel is great into Rain and Greninja. It checks things like Ludicolo, it checks things like Greninja. I think a potential Assault Vest variant on that thing could definitely be very valuable, or just Black Sludge Rain Dish to get ridiculous amounts of recovery if that rain does end up going up. That could obviously be very, very nice and very solid. It also offsets the sand if you have sand up, which again is very nice. Clef soft checks Gren, and it's probably one of your better defensive back answers, but again, it also is probably one of your best Ursaluna answers. So you kind of have to pick your poison. I think you probably end up going Spadef to check like Sludge Wave, Gren, and Ursaluna Blood Moon, and then because of that, you're going to get smoked by an Icicle Crash if that is a Banded Baxcalibur. I think you do want to go unaware in this matchup. So you'll be able to take a +1 hit if it is like a Dragon Dance Baxcalibur, and you'll always be able to take a hit from it. So that's obviously very, very valuable, but it's something you're just going to have to keep in mind in building. I think Ogre looks really strong offensively. Just Grass plus Knock is really, really strong here, to be completely honest. You can rock out with Fighting coverage as well to hit Baxcalibur super effectively, or even Play Rough, but Low Kick seems like it has better neutral coverage into the rest of the team, so that's probably what you rock out with. You can go Trailblazer, you can go Swords Dance. There really is a ton of options for the IV Cudgelbon here to do some, you know, pretty good work here. Latios can also function a way to break for Sandrill, so if you decide you do want to go Sandrill, I think you have to use Latios early to get in that Bronzong, force a Shadow Ball on it, do a lot of damage to that guy, and then potentially your drill can come in a little bit later. It can set up a Swords Dance and it can really start breaking through, or it could just pick a KO and switch out when the Greninja clicks Water Shuriken and forces it out. So that's obviously something to keep in mind. And then I think Houndstone also looks really strong. If you can chip down or get rid of that Luna, I think Houndstone is really, really powerful in this matchup, especially with the Terra capabilities that it has. Let me see, what is its Terra types again? I know it can be Ghost. I don't think Ghost is great in particular in this matchup. I do want to look at the Terra type real quick, because I am blanking on whether or not it's fighting or not. And I think if it's fighting, you definitely want to go Terra fighting on that guy. Let's see, I'm sorry, the dock is being a little bit slow to load up. We're getting her going, I promise. Okay. So, Kyle's Terra type, oh my gosh, it's still not showing up. Well, maybe I'll put something on the screen whether or not it's Terra fighting or not, but again, I do think it's a very solid Pokemon in the matchup. Nonetheless, even if it's not Terra fighting, if we could chip it down with body presses, if we could force other Pokemon in, or if we can force it in on other Pokemon and really, really chip down the team, we're going to be in a pretty good spot. So, yeah, that is going to be SPL Draft Notes Week 1. A little bit shorter of an episode this week just because we can't go over the prior week's matches because they haven't happened. And we can't go over any really cool plays or anything like that from, the week because, again, it hasn't happened. So next week we'll have that aspect and we'll go over the Week 2 matchups. If you did enjoy it, again, I would really appreciate it if you dropped a sub. So you can catch these episodes every week when they go up in your sub box and so that you could help me out and reaching that 5,000 sub goal. Again, it's completely free. It really helps me out a ton and I would super appreciate it. And yeah, that being said, I'll see you guys next time. Later.